In 2023, the so-called tech winter was still abound, with many startups both globally and in Indonesia suffering layoffs, some even shut down. But what about 2024? Will this tech winter still continue, or will we start to see some optimistic conditions? To discuss more, we're going to be talking with Roderick Purwana. He's a managing partner of venture capital firm East Ventures. Roderick, thank you so much for speaking with you today.
Good to be here.
But before we talk about 2024, I want to look back at 2023 first. How did you and East Ventures see the startup and venture capital industry, both in Indonesia and Southeast Asia as well?
Yeah, I think 2023 was a challenging year for a lot of people as well, right? I think especially in the venture capital industry, and a lot of that began in through second part of 2022, right, where we start to see some global challenges on the economy, rising inflation, rising interest rate environment as well, right? That move a lot of people from riskier assets to sort of more standard or more sort of less risky assets, I guess, right? So it was quite abrupt as well, right? So I think a lot of people were expecting things to still go pretty well, and I think it was realization, I guess, a time for realization, right? So for 2023, a lot of companies, a lot of founders, and a lot of venture capital firms as well were faced with the reality that things might not be as great, right? So what some people call the tech winter, I guess, right? And a lot of this started with the more mature markets like the U.S., of course, right? U.S. has always been sort of the leader, I guess, in the industry, right? And then where a lot of other parts of the world also follows, I guess. So with that, I think in Indonesia in particular, right, we see some challenges that trickles down also into the companies. We saw some reductions in force. We saw some businesses or startups closing down as well in 2023, right? So overall, I think it was a year that is filled with uncertainty, I guess, right?
Right, but how about for the venture capital and maybe investing into those startups itself in 2023? Yeah. Was it according to your expectation or no?
Yeah, I think for venture capital in particular, right, as a result of that, I think in general, funding slowed down overall as well. So I think venture capital became also more selective, I guess, right? So it doesn't mean that there's no funding at all, so things don't go to zero. But if you look at in terms of the statistics, definitely funding went down and people became a lot more selective. So it was becoming harder for founders and companies to raise capital also from venture capital during 2023. Yeah.
Right, but so a lot of those challenges perhaps started to build up or sort of reach a peak in 2023, but how do you see 2024? Do you see kind of this tech winter and all these challenges faced by startup and VCs continuing this year?
Yeah, I think 2024 is still a period of where I guess people are questioning right now whether we've seen the bottom or we're going to still see the bottom in 2024, right? I think there's reason to be hopeful that we're looking at, right? Again, one of it is potentially. So US was supposed to have a recession. So far, we're seeing maybe more of a soft landing rather than a recession, right? 2024 is also a year where we have so many global elections as well, right? So I think, of course, during these times, I think people tend to wait and see or try to understand the market first. So we don't think 2024 will be, that much different than 2023 from that respect in terms of investment activities, but we are hopeful and we're starting to see signs of activities and people are starting to deploy more capital as well into the market, especially in the US, yeah, right? Again, and US usually is a beacon or a sign, right? So how things are going to go as well. Yeah.
Right, but maybe for the Indonesian market itself, do you see maybe venture capital firms such as yours sort of still being cautious in 2024, or maybe, for example, like their forecast that the Fed might potentially cut their rates towards the end of the year or maybe in the middle of this year? How's that going to affect the outlook for investing into startups this year?
I mean, so most people are projecting that the interest rate hikes have stopped or are coming up to a stop and then potentially will come down later this year, right? I think the certainty of not increasing rates anymore it gives people confidence to start investing back into riskier assets, into like venture capital. If the Fed does start to cut rates, and there are expectations of them once they start cutting rates to do it quite fast, at least, right? That will translate to also potentially increases in multiples in terms of how these companies are valued as well, right? So it's a multiple stage process, I guess, right? But there's definitely an effect of interest rate, especially in the US, into how people are looking at investing into riskier assets like venture capital.
Right now, as you say that for 2024 could be a time for investing into riskier assets because of the Fed rate cuts, as you said. What kind of sectors do you think are the most prospective in 2024? Maybe, what about AI?
Yeah, I think so for East Ventures, right? I think we have always been sector agnostic in our approach, right? I mean, our core flagship funds are seed and growth. So we look at all sectors, right? But of course, there are trends in terms of sectors that are interesting and becoming more interesting, right? So even the traditional parts, I think we are still invested in e-commerce, fintech, logistics, and whatnot, but we're starting to see new areas emerging as well, right? So a couple of the areas we have been looking at in the past year or so, and then going to this year is one in terms of energy transition and climate, right? I think it's also a big theme for everyone this year. The other one is healthcare, right? I think the pandemic exposed how fragile our healthcare infrastructure is, and with the reform of the Bill of Health last year as well in Indonesia, we also believe that there will spur a lot of innovation in the space. Now, with regards to AI, as you asked, right? I mean, that has been sort of the major trend, I guess, if you will, globally, right, in the past year, and of course, Indonesia is also going to go through the same trend. I think we're still we've taken a look, and we've started engaging companies that are active in the space. So we're still looking heavily in the space. So we need to decide, and we need to look into which areas, particularly within AI, that could make sense for companies in Indonesia and in Southeast Asia to do.
But now in 2023, we saw a lot of layoffs, both globally and in Indonesia, among many startups. Do you see those kind of layoffs continuing in 2024 in Indonesia and maybe regionally as well?
I think layoff happens to good, bad company. Layoff happens in good and bad times as well, right? So it's not unique to the current condition or current, to the startup ecosystem, I guess, right? So, and it could be for various reasons and factors as well, right? I think, some might do it for restructuring, some might do it for efficiencies and whatnot, right? So it's very hard to predict layoffs as well, right?
Okay, but now another major challenge this year, globally and affecting many countries is geopolitical tensions and conflicts as well. How do you see that affecting the startup and VC industry in Indonesia and maybe Southeast Asia as well?
Yeah, I mean, Southeast Asia and Indonesia in particular have shown neutrality in the larger geopolitical scheme, right? And that has been very good for us, I guess, right? But regardless, as part of the global citizen, I guess, if you will, right? I mean, there is effect of the geopolitical conditions now, right? But the largest maybe effect for Indonesia in the short term would be the election, I guess, right? It's the near-term things that will potentially affect most in terms of sentiment and how people will behave, I guess, for this year in Indonesia.
Okay, so let's talk about that. The presidential elections, the Indonesian presidential and general elections. How do you see that affecting the startup and venture capital industry this year?
I guess usually globally as well, during elections, there are wait and sees from investors, right? So I think typically people slow down up to an election or the outcome of an election, right? I think we haven't seen as much of that so far, and we're coming up to a few weeks into the presidential election for Indonesia. I think people would like to see the clarity or the certainty or what happens, right?
How about the outcome after the presidential and general elections conclude in February? How do you see that affecting the startup and VC industry?
Yeah, I think the Indonesian government historically have been supportive of the ecosystem, and they haven't really meddled too much into the ecosystem, right? So in a way that it's a good thing, meaning that whoever wins the election, we don't believe there will be too much change in terms of how the outlook or prospect of the digital economy is going to be, right? So, and looking at some of the initial or work plans for digital for the three candidates as well, right? I think we think all of them, have to a certain extent, right? I think good points that can be or should be implemented as well, right? So I think so far we believe that this despite the election and whoever wins the election, for us we believe that it will be there will be a good prospect for digital economy for Indonesia.
Right. What are your hopes, though, from the government itself for sort of supporting the startup and VC industry?
As I said, I think our government has been pretty good in terms of the support that they give to the founder startup, and they haven't really intervened much, if any, right? I mean, I think there's of course cases and whatnot that I think could be seen as that, but maybe what will be interesting is to increase the engagement and dialogue between the founders and the government and the multi-stakeholders. So one of the things that could be interesting is maybe for the government to play more of a coordinating role, I guess, right? In terms of putting together all the different stakeholders and then figuring out challenges and then how to potentially solve them together, right? And maybe I'll take a step further from that, right? And it's not just within the country as well, right? So I think last year we hosted the ASEAN Summit, right? And what could be interesting is not only maybe coordinating or facilitating activities within the country, but among ASEAN countries, maybe, for example, right? One of the key projects that was pushed last year was ASEAN QR, right? That will promote financial inclusion within the different countries as well, right? So that's a good example of your government's role in terms of facilitating and doing things across the region, right? And increasing things, and not just within the country.
Okay, but I just want to get your final thoughts. 2024, still many challenges, but a lot of institutions and people are saying 2025 is the year when things will finally become better. How do you see it?
I think as an industry, venture capital, you have to have hope and you have to be hopeful for the future, right? So I think in general, we've always been positive about how things are. But I think, again, 2023 brought a sense of realism and say that, okay, you have to hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. But we think that, 2025 could be an interesting year. But again, of course, we are always cautious and we are mindful. We tell our companies and our founders the same things, whether it's a crisis or good times as well, right? I think focus on your product, focus on your core product, right? And then you have to always be mindful of that, right? I mean, if you're mindful of that, you're wary of the market condition. I think whether it's a great year or just a good year, I think they should do quite well.
Okay, Pak Roderick Purwana, Managing Partner of East Ventures, thank you so much for giving us your insights.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pak.
Thank you.